covering this game cost me a controller and a camera. That's not a joke, my Sony ZV-1 straight up died during the making of this video. So there's my review of that camera, don't buy it. Alright, seriously, who do I need to talk to about the snubbing of the PS2 Castlevania games? We had Lament of Innocence over here, awakening something inside of me that, for the good of all mankind, probably should have stayed hidden. And then we've got Curse of Darkness over here, doing some very different, but equally cool things too. Two flavors of Castlevania that ultimately are very Castlevania right to the bone, but veer off in different directions, and then sort of meet up somewhere in the middle, somewhere along the way too. Gothic action games have had plenty of heavyweight entries to hold up the subgenre, but Curse may genuinely be one of the coolest, and I barely see anyone talk about it. We have sick combos, hard and rewarding boss fights, a white-haired edgy protagonist, and arm blades that seem like logistical nightmares, so really, all of these boxes are ticked for me. All of this is wrapped up in an evolved Metroidvania experience that takes the focus of ability gathering away from the player and instead morphs that into a demon summoning system, which weirdly enough makes this game kind of reminiscent of an SMT game, I guess, which is pretty cool. At first glance, this game is way more of a straightforward action game than Lament of Innocence is, at least notionally. And at the start of the adventure, I was a little down about how simplified the structure seemed to be, but I was gladly proven wrong as Curse of Darkness began to throw some really cool curveballs my way. We still have some elements of backtracking, using certain items to unlock certain paths, and sometimes we even have a new skill enter our arsenal. Yet the sum of Curse of Darkness's parts make it stand out quite a bit from Lament. I think the direction that Curse of Darkness takes makes plenty of sense. Linearly progressing through levels, killing enemies as I go, and looking down corridors for any helpful items feels a lot better in this game because areas look at least a little bit more unique now. And by a little bit, I really do mean a little bit. Things have not changed that much. But I don't feel like I'm getting lost anywhere near as much now. And now that we've got a fully movable camera, it's easier to get a lay of the land. And my first impressions of this game were, wow, these places are really wide. Because of the camera now being movable and needing space to make combat at all legible, areas are now a lot bigger on average than they used to be in Lament. It works really well though to better illustrate the scale of some of these locations. Massive castles feel like massive castles now, and large rooms now have some grandiose that really add to the overall mood. And we still get some claustrophobic places too that work well with Curse's camera to give us some of that contrast. Going from a big castle to a dingy catacomb and then to a mountain range works really well, and diversified locations that would be otherwise a little boring to traverse. Right away, the camera gives Curse of Darkness a distinctly different flavor that forces a different sort of environmental design. I know that this was also a very welcome addition for people that don't like fixed camera angles, which I understand completely. But as an avid fixed camera enjoyer, I do kind of miss it. But it's not just the camera that's different. We've got a new character to play with this time around, Hector, who was previously a servant of Dracula as a Devil Forge Master, which has to be up there as one of the coolest job titles I've ever heard. This game is actually a sequel to Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, so it kind of spoils that game's story, I guess, but I watched the Netflix show, so I'm not exactly blind to all of this anyway. Hector is out to get revenge on Isaac, a fellow Devil Forge Master who is still loyal to Dracula and his evil ways. Isaac caused the death of Hector's fiancée, which sets Hector back on the path he thought he had left behind. He now has to use his knowledge and gain back his former power to defeat Isaac and put an end to Dracula's madness once and for all. Or at the very least until Dracula pops back up once again, but that's a problem for someone else to deal with. Hector is obviously not a Belmont, so he does not use the Vampire Killer or any variation of whip. He instead can use a variety of swords, axes, spears, and Street Fighter moves to take down enemies instead. So yeah, there's a shit ton more variety to be found in this combat than any other Castlevania that I am aware of. Hector also has the ability to create and command innocent devils, which essentially act as partners in combat that can perform a ton of different actions like healing Hector or demolishing enemies. Coupling this stuff with wide map exploration and plenty of interesting combat scenarios, boss battles, and a standard yet satisfying tale of revenge, and this is once again a Castlevania that I am very invested in. But just like with Lament of Innocence, I think Curse of Darkness's aesthetic is what gets me going the most. That dark gothic vibe is in full swing here and certainly takes cues from what the previous games did in its visual design. But there's also a distinct approach here that makes this game feel much darker, dingier, dustier, certainly less elegant than some of the places I've seen before in the series. The starting area is the abandoned castle, which immediately illustrates the kind of vibe I'm talking about. You've got tons of greys, browns, darker browns, some water to add a little life to the area, but then we're back to dark greys, tattered reds, and interior fog that makes the area feel oddly claustrophobic. I get a really intense post-apocalypse vibe from this place. I assume it was brought up for an evil purpose, but has since been left to wither and lost what little light it originally had to begin with. The outside areas don't do much to change this idea except for the vines growing on the walls, which once again add to the age of the area, but also shows a key conflict within the aesthetic too. Life is growing here despite the evil nature of the castle, which might be a way of indicating that the darkness isn't wholly consuming it. It makes for a nice contrast that fits in perfectly with Hector, someone that renounced his evil ways to instead have a normal life, which Curse makes a point to connect dozens of times throughout the game, that dichotomy between light and dark. That low draw distance fog serves to hide the scale of areas on approach too, which makes entering a room and moving through a corridor a really fun time as you discover what lies further in. I initially thought that the fog was a design limitation to help out the PS2, which I'm sure is the case sometimes, but a lot of areas actually cut down on this fog a ton and show off plenty of the landscape without any fog, which makes its inclusion in certain areas feel way more deliberate. And it makes for one of the coolest little reveals in the game when you finally see Dracula's castle unshrouded by the fog on approach. It is really interesting how Curse of Darkness goes about detailing its areas because aesthetically, they all follow the same sort of rules. Plenty of dark colors, that same dark gothic theming, that same dusty vibe. All of the areas follow along with this sort of idea, and that runs the risk of homogenizing them to the point where they all sort of blend together. But Curse of Darkness gets out of this with all of these subtle details and making really good use of scale. The Mortavia Aqueduct feels like a completely different sort of place to the Balajet Mountains, even though they share some very similar vibes. They even seem to share quite a few textures, and a lot of the room layouts are even very similar. But because the scale of these areas contrasts with each other perfectly, and all of the little tiny touches, they feel different enough. The mountains have these narrow paths, but the open sky doesn't make them feel too claustrophobic and tight, while the aqueduct's tighter interiors make everything feel much closer. Which might sound really obvious, but remember, Lament of Innocence's rooms were all basically the exact same thing, repeated again and again and again. So to see some genuine variety here, I was so happy to see it. Like I mentioned with the abandoned castle, you have these outdoor areas that let you see the castle from other perspectives, which really pays off when you ascend the castle and catch a glimpse of the blood red moon. It gives this whole area some much needed contrast. While Curse of Darkness has plenty of repetitive corridors and rooms that do mostly look the same, it also knows when to give you something just a little different. The minute-to-minute structure is also much more linear this time around, with Hector going from stage to stage in a very linear fashion, unlike in Lament of Innocence, where you get to freely choose which area you're tackling in whichever order you want. You'll come back to areas in Curse when you've got an ability to get past an obstacle, but the areas themselves don't really demand much exploration from you, really. The game really likes to have two paths that wind back around onto the central route to give you the illusion of choosing where to go, and that's honestly really funny. The game does this so many times. But the subtle changes in environment from location to location are an important part of the experience. Hector's journey literally takes him high and low as he regains his dark powers, and the visual aspects of that journey work well to convey a ton of emotions and moods. I really love the Garibaldi Temple, which is the first area where we get to see some softer lighting and color palettes. The stained glass illuminating the halls, corridors leading into pavilions where enemies lurk, and then these massive rooms with more stained glass, destroyed organs, and even more of that dingy vibe. I guess you really could just call this game dingy as a catch-all term, but in a positive way. It's like when you go down into a pitch black basement and think, damn, this could work. I was trying to think about what other games spring to mind when I look at Curse of Darkness's aesthetics, and I came back to The cream of the crop when it comes to gothic video game representation, I know, and it does feel a little unfair to compare these two games, but really if you look at places like the Forbidden Woods and the Forest of Digrament, both places manage to conjure up the same sort of vibe. Dark wooded areas lit by pale moonlight and the odd torch placed down to give you something to head towards. Even the castles and other like-minded areas give me some of those same vibes, which is really cool to see. There's a lot of talk about how Souls games can be seen as being successors to Castlevania, which I don't usually agree 100% with, but there are times where I see the vision. I also refer back to the whole Blood Red Moon thing, because yeah, both games do that too. This game ultimately grounds its setting really well. Maybe a little too well at certain points where I think the designs could have been a little more interesting. Like, Iolon Cave Temple is just a big catacomb. Like, there's not much going on here. But then half an hour later, you're wandering around a pocket in space-time. So, Curse of Darkness clearly knows when it needs to spice things up, and honestly, I'm impressed when it does. The music here is incredible as well. At this point, I'm not even sure I need to mention it, but I will anyway. The very first theme of this game, for the abandoned castle, is such a good way to start things off. Blending the classic sounds of Castlevania with these really fast beats and this droning electric guitar, and then the synth comes in. Oh my god, it's such an amazing song. Then you get music that plays with the vibe of the area really well too. Mortavia Aqueduct has a really cool theme that's a little calmer than what we've had so far, but still has those hype moments in the song that gives exploration more energy to vibe with. But I absolutely cannot forget to mention Trevor Belmont's theme, which combines this sick electric guitar sound with this grand backing instrumentation. Makes him feel like a badass, but also someone to genuinely be a little scared of. The entire soundtrack is filled with incredible songs though, and I can't really name one that I don't like. They mash the past and present of Castlevania's sounds together to create something that feels both new and harmonious with the soundtracks of the older games. But I don't want to completely disregard the sound design, because this game is a treat when you turn the music off too. The subtle little sounds of the environment, like wind passing through gaps in the walls, Hector's footsteps echoing through the halls, and even things like water features doing their thing in some rooms. This stuff was nearly impossible for me to notice with the music playing, and knowing how much detail there is in the sound design made the game feel so much more engaging to me. Even combat without music has this rhythmic sense to it that works so well. All of the battle effects, grunts, and unique enemy sounds almost act like music on their own. But things rightly calm down a little bit when we get to a save room. The music is replaced with a calm, droning sound as we're greeted with this half-demonic, half-angelic throne, which Hector sits on to save the game. This half-and-half aesthetic is once again emblematic of Hector's overall character, his dark powers mixed in with his desire to do good, and the way that the wings of the chair envelop him as the save begins is all quite comforting to see. That dichotomy is also found in a lot of the game's menus, with the design moving away from Lament's gothic Catholic inspirations to something that looks a little bit more chaotic. It's got the vibe of a Winamp skin called Toxic or Acid, I think. These bright deep greens and oranges mixed with the blues in the background, and then all the little alchemical symbols and gothic patterns make the menu feel a little conflicted aesthetically. But again, this darker or more evil presentation is in line with Hector's character and his past. Everything is in service to representing Hector's key characteristics. Ultimately, the save room does more than just signify this contrast though. The soft lighting here is also a break from the majority of the game's other areas. Remember, this game is dingy complimentary, and the save room not only acts as a good contrast, but also a sincerely comforting area to find, especially when you're 2 steps away from a game over. The warp room is similarly laid out, but instead of a place of comfort, we've got a place that looks otherworldly, like some sort of ancient power is coursing through its veins as the lines on the floor light with some kind of energy. It gives the room a sort of power that only something befitting a fast travel could have. But the room that gets the highest score for vibes is Julia's shop. Warm, soft lighting, tons of little details like books cascading on top of each other, a rocking chair to take a rest, and one of the chillest shop themes I've heard in a long while too. Honestly, the vibes are immaculate here. Speaking of chairs too, that's one of this game's most fascinating Easter eggs. There are tons of chairs throughout the game that Hector can sit on that range from ones like the save room and fast travel chairs to gaming chairs and even an electric chair. This is all kind of spoofing on Dracula's throne in my eyes. I'm also just imagining that this is one of Hector's hobbies, trying to find the perfect chair to sit on to finally take home with him. And as a final note, while I'm gushing about this game's visuals, I really want to point out how much I love Hector's design. He's got so much going on here, from the dark colors and literally sharp clothing to indicate that dark side he has, but balancing that with blues, his white glove, and then his white hair, which strike against those darker elements perfectly. It's a bit funny that he still dresses like this after being away from Dracula for 3 years, but it speaks to a level of gothic fashion that few characters have ever matched. Plus the addition of the red sash that gives his design some extra movement and a splash of color is so smart. It's sincerely one of my favorite designs for a character ever. It is so good. Trevor Belmont also deserves some love. Sincerely one of the sexiest goth fits I have ever seen from a game, let alone Castlevania. He's wearing thigh-high heels, for fuck's sake. Thank God you get to play him after being in the game, because I would have been sad if you didn't. I'd have been mad if you didn't. Actually, yeah, speaking of playing the game, Curse of Darkness is not only a competent action game, it's an incredible one. And I've got to be honest, when I finished up Lament of Innocence, I was really sad that the whip was going away, at least for the first playthrough. So I was kinda down about moving away from it after being so in love with it. But then I almost immediately forgot all about that when I got to mess around with the sheer amount of weapons on offer here. Like, sure, I was upset that the whip wasn't here, but this is a goddamn buffet, and I'm not going to complain when there are so many meals to choose from. Each weapon class comes with its own attacks, combos, and uses that will have you switching pretty often throughout the game. The combo system also has been changed a lot here, with Hector having only one attack string button on square. Then if you press circle at any point during a combo, you'll perform a combo finisher that can differ depending on the weapon you have equipped. You can get finishers that are good for catching groups, or ones that inflict a ton of damage on a single opponent. Pretty much all of this stuff is left for you to mess around with. There's nothing like a command list to look at, but the combos aren't really that complicated anyway. In fact, a lot of this game's whole ethos is about messing around with stuff and seeing what works, which extends over to the game's combining mechanic that lets Hector combine weapons and materials to make even better weapons and armor. Eventually, you'll have to make the choice of using one of your favorite weapons to make something else, which usually results in something objectively better, but if you're a fan of how something looks, you may want to keep what you've got. If you're a fan of the bamboo sword, you can keep that if you want, that's up to you. Gathering materials for combinations actually gives you a reason to take on almost every enemy you see as well, which I really couldn't say was the case for Lament of Innocence. In that game, you could just run away from most enemies unless you were locked in until you killed them all, which does still happen in Curse of Darkness, but they were all going to die anyway, so a door being locked doesn't really matter that much. Aside from materials, you also gain experience from killing monsters, which levels up Hector just like it worked in Symphony of the Night for Alucard, which is cool because both characters' whole journeys are about regaining the power that they once had. I love how Castlevania contextualizes this stuff, with Belmonts never really needing this sort of system because they're already as cool as they can be. So they supplement by chugging random health ups they find in dingy castles, which really cannot be good for your health, ironically. Now, there is a lot of stuff you can do in combat, but does any of it actually feel good? Well, yes. Combat in Curse of Darkness is snappy as hell, with Hector being able to whip out combos in this really punchy way. And getting hit by enemies does not take you out of the rhythm for long, since you can just get right back in there and start hitting stuff straight away. It helps the combat maintain a fast pace, even against enemies that can tank a lot of damage. Boss fights often feel really fast-paced because of this too, to the point that encounters against Trevor Belmont feel pretty accurate to how they should actually be. I sincerely feel like I'm fighting for my life here, and it's never not fun. I am personally disgusted, though, that the jump kick has been omitted from this game, which genuinely hurts my feelings a little bit. That was my favorite move from Lament, so yeah, I'll be starting a petition to bring that back. Sign up, and we'll see what we can do. I already love the combat in Lament of Innocence, and Curse of Darkness manages to take things in a slightly different direction by making everything feel a lot faster and more reactive. It's also undeniable that getting to mix up your loadout makes the game feel much fresher as it goes on. I'm not saying that this combat is super deep or anything, but it is really fun. Like I said in the last video, I don't really need combat to be in-depth or super complicated to the point where I have to go to GameFAQs to see if I've missed anything. If the basics are fun, then that's all I really need to have a good time. And Curse of Darkness just builds on what was already good while giving you distinct options that impact your playstyle. Some weapons are really slow to use, and that makes playing in the same ways you would with short swords or fist or, much faster weapons much harder to do. You have to be strategic since you're way more likely to get hit, especially when you're winding up to do some kind of finisher. I never really used bigger, heavier weapons unless their damage really melted a boss, but heavy weapons make a lot more sense when you've got a buddy helping you out. That's right, Curse of Darkness has a summoning system where Hector can conjure up innocent devils to help him out in combat. Each innocent devil has a completely different role in combat, with the first you get being a healer first and foremost. Then you get one that's a tanky damage dealer, and then one that deals range attacks from afar. Innocent devils are an incredibly fun part of the game, and what makes them even cooler is that they each have different evolutionary pathways. As you attack enemies with certain weapons, you'll get evolution crystals that contribute to evolving a devil down a certain path. This then gets them unique abilities, and sometimes they can get really weird, but they can also get pretty broken, like with the fairy eventually being able to make you invincible for a little while. Now when a game has a companion or a summon system like this, I sometimes roll my eyes a little bit because I just imagine all of the headaches that it causes. Having to spend time grinding out materials and leveling up characters besides the pro tag can feel like a chore, but Curse of Darkness is so smart because you barely have to do anything out of the way to improve your innocent devils. They gain experience in the exact same way as Hector by simply having enemies die in their presence. And since every weapon class is fun to use in some way, swapping a weapon out to evolve a devil in a specific direction really isn't so bad. They're also a joy to use in combat because they never get in the way. You can even choose to set them to auto and have them use their abilities at random if you really want to be hands-off. Hell, if you really hate them all that much, you can just keep them in your pocket and never bring them out. All of this stuff clicks together in ways I really didn't expect it to at first. I thought that Innocent Devils would slow the game down too much by forcing me to juggle one too many things in combat, but that wasn't the case at all, and I could not be happier. Especially because these guys make up a lot of Hector's persona and separates him from every other character in this series. So what we have here is a fluid combat system with plenty of choice and ways to keep things fresh alongside a devil summoning system that fits alongside the basics of combat almost perfectly. And that constant taking a progression for both Hector and the innocent devils makes the minute-to-minute loop feel really rewarding. You aren't left with large gaps where you aren't really progressing anything and are just kind of walking down a corridor. You're almost always fighting enemies, collecting materials, and every now and then using innocent devil abilities to explore the world. I suppose the only real nitpick I have with Curse of Darkness is the lack of platforming. Sure, this wasn't the best part of Lament of Innocence, but they at least tried to incorporate some cool stuff in that game with the whip and having some timing-based platform puzzles. Which isn't to say that Curse has none of that, because it sort of does. The moment that sticks out to me the most is when you can use the glide ability to get from the Tower of Eternity to the Tower of Evermore. It's a really neat little thing to discover, and I wish Curse had way more of this kind of thing, because even decent platforming and little touches like this helps to spice things up a little bit. But as we approach the end of this video, I cannot not talk about your reward for beating the game, which is to go through it again as Trevor Belmont himself. The whip is back and better than ever with a combo system that works very similarly to Hector's. The only difference is that Trevor has additional inputs with square after certain finishes that give you more attacks to play with. Trevor hits hard, looks hard, and ironically makes the game easier, which I suppose is appropriate. I didn't beat the game with him for the record, but I did go through about half of it again, and it was a breeze for the most part. Trevor doesn't get access to any on-demand heals like potions and can only heal from items dropped by enemies, so that means you'll need to approach boss fights with way more caution, especially because you don't have innocent devils to back you up. Trevor is cool as hell though. The whip feels incredible to use, and It's impressive how well suited to the game he feels. I don't really like talking about which things I prefer over the other, because I'm kind of over that whole thought process. I like different stuff for different reasons, so when I say I like Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness about equally, that means I think they're both really shitting good. Lament of Innocence's biggest letdown was probably its simplicity, but that ultimately worked perfectly for what the game was trying to do. What I mean to say is that Curse of Darkness feels like an evolution of Lament of Innocence in the best way possible. It is still a simple experience in a lot of ways, but there's plenty here that adds just a little more texture to the overall experience and plenty of stuff to discover. Maybe I'm just a schlup for PS2 action games at this point, which is definitely true, but I also find that these two games are sincerely beautiful. The presentation of these gothic settings, mixed in with some supernatural horror, really shine. To the point that I can still remember a lot of these locations even now, and my memory is absolute dog shit, so that's saying a lot. It's a shame that this is where Castlevania's journey on the PS2 ends, but thank God it's a good ending. I would much rather we end this on a high, rather than it slowly whittling itself to the grave. And I think that these two games have a very special place in the PS2's library. New fans are coming into the series now and maybe starting with these games, and I sincerely hope you guys enjoy them as much as I do. Curse of Darkness in particular strives to make its mark in its own way, and in that sense, it manages to be the perfect sequel to Lament of Innocence, becoming an experience that feels like an evolution that's different enough to not directly overwrite the previous game. I would happily play both of these games again at any time. I truly loved experiencing them for the first time here on the channel. But now I have to leave Castlevania behind for a little while. Who knows when we'll meet Dracula again, or when I'll see a Belmont again, but it's been a great ride, and thank you for watching. I'll just, fuck it. I'm gonna play Symphony of the Night again.